Hey, what's up? So today I want to talk about how I got my 2011 335 X Drive for only $2,000 and the adventure that I went through fixing it. So in March of this year, 2021, my dad texted me saying that he had found a BMW 335 for sale. He was buying a truck. The owner, as he was going to look at this truck, just happened to offer like, "Hey, would you want to buy a 335 as well?" And my dad was like, "No, but I know someone who does." So he reached out to me and told me that there was a 335 that needed some work. He sent it to me as a potential flip. The owner was telling us that he thought it had timing chain issues, but he didn't really have any evidence to back it up. And I kind of doubted it from the beginning, but they were saying that it was tough to start and that it ran really rough when it did start. The owner also told us that the odometer was at 170,000. Keep that in mind for later. So I reached out to the seller myself to try and gain more information about it. Same thing, he told me it was tough to start and that it was in limp mode when it did start. I kind of ignored the timing chain issues that he thought it had, and I kind of assumed that it was just high pressure fuel pump or maybe low pressure even issues, because it was just a typical thing that I knew about with N54s, N55s. But I obviously wasn't going to tell him what I thought was wrong with the car. So I went to go look at the car, took a look around it. The car wouldn't start, the battery was dead. So I just went and I looked under the hood. There was oil in the coolant reservoir. There was oil around the valve cover and a ton of oil around the oil filter housing area. The belt wasn't shredded, but it was covered in oil. The alternator was also covered in oil, the intake, everything. Seriously, there's oil everywhere. It was greasier than the sink in the back of a McDonald's or something. It was absolutely lubed up. But the interior was mostly fine, and I noticed that the car had all the luxury / convenience features, so I knew it would sell well even if I did have to part it out. After asking some general questions about the car, I realized that the owner kind of didn't know much about mechanics. So I pointed out all my concerns and risks, such as the oil leaks, such as it mixing in the coolant and being all over the belt. I told him how it could possibly slip off the tensioner and get sucked into the crankshaft's front seal and absolutely destroy the engine if it hadn't already, but it didn't look like it did. So I told him the risks and my concerns and stuff. I asked him how much he wanted. He told me $2,500 for the car, but I ended up offering $2,000 as my honest consideration of the risks and unknown factors. Because keep in mind, I did not see the car run. I was just completely trusting his word. The car wouldn't start when I was there, which was kind of risky on my part, but that's why I was only going to offer up $2,000. But I knew that if there was nothing more broken than what I expected, that it would be well worth my risk. Keep in mind, he was selling us a truck too as well, to my dad. So he seemed like an honest guy and I trusted him. So I put everything on the table and everything that I was considering, like the fact that it wasn't running, to use as selling points. So I gave him an offer of $2,000. He didn't think about it for very long, and I could kind of tell that he just was kind of done with the car. He didn't want to deal with it. So he accepted $2,000 and we shook hands. At this time, my dad had already paid for the truck and was just waiting for the title to be signed over. After we had agreed on the price for the 335, he offered to give me some free tires, BMW tires that he no longer needed. So I ended up getting 4 snow tires and 4 summer tires completely for free, and this was before paying him or anything. So at this point, I completely trusted that everything he told me that he knew about the car and how he maintained it was going to be true. I just completely trusted him at this point. So I really didn't think that there was going to be any timing chain issues. So all in all, I got a 2011 335 and 8 tires for $2,000. So after getting the car towed to the shop, I charged up the battery and see if the car would start, and sure enough it did. It, just like they said, it took some time to start and it idled pretty rough, but it did start. And sure enough, the car was also in limp mode. I read the codes. It gave me 12 codes, I think, and they all kind of pointed in the same direction, like low fuel pressure and multiple misfires, pretty much all giving me the same information. So aside from its poor idle and whatnot, the engine sounded like it was turning pretty good, but to my surprise, the mileage was actually lower than they said. The odometer was around 158,500 miles, so that was a pretty good surprise. But more unexpected surprise is the next time I started up, I noticed that the PCV was whistling, so that would mean that the valve cover would need to be replaced as well. But I knew that the valve cover gasket was leaking as it is, so I wasn't too concerned. So I bought a new valve cover kit from Amazon for only about $100, And then I bought a used high pressure fuel pump from my local part out guy for $100 as well. And then finally I bought an oil filter housing gasket kit from FCP Euro, which included the intake manifold gaskets. So I began taking things apart, such as the intake, without any trouble, but everything, and I mean everything, was covered in oil. It was absolutely filthy. Touching any part of the engine bay and working on this car for any extended period would completely stain my clothes and my skin with just black filth. Here's a picture of what I looked like after some of the work on the 335. So after I got the intake manifold off, I was able to access the high pressure fuel pump and replace it without any issues. Here's a picture of the original one that was covered in oil. Also, with the intake manifold off, that's when I replaced the oil filter housing gasket. With the tools I was working with, it was necessary for me to remove that infamous Mickey Mouse coolant flange on the front side to get that rear bolt for the oil filter housing gasket. When I went to open up the oil filter housing to sop up some of the oil that was inside of it, I grabbed my oil filter tool, and I noticed that the cap for the oil filter was literally on hand tight. Not only that, I don't think it had the O-ring on the inside of the cap. But yeah, there was just a lot of questionable things that made me wonder about how the previous owner had taken care of it. But I did know that the previous owner had allowed his kids to drive it, and probably they attempted working on it as well. And clearly they didn't get very far. And honestly, they are damn lucky that the belt didn't get sucked into the engine. Well, actually, I shouldn't say them, I should say me. But it didn't look like any bit of the belt was shredded at all. So with the intake manifold off, I had taken quite a bit of time to degrease that side of the block. And I didn't care too much about perfection, but it was just absolutely filthy because of all the oil that leaked out of the oil filter cap. When I was doing some further research on N55s, I ended up stumbling just by chance across this myth, or rumor, I should say, about engines seizing up after replacing oil filter housing gaskets. And only N55s, not N54s or not N52s, even though they had the same oil filter housing style. But it was released by BMW officially to do a certain procedure afterwards, and I won't go too into detail about that. But it was just another concern of mine that maybe the engine would just fucking spin a bearing and blow up after spending all the time fixing it. But I wasn't going to think about it at that point. So I finished reinstalling the right side of the engine, and I equipped a new VRSF charge pipe, which the fitment was kind of dog, but I eventually got everything to fit up properly, and that was that. So now I started taking things apart to get ready to do the valve cover, and I was a little nervous. I had done valve covers plenty of times before, but never on a direct injection car. So there was a few extra things that needed to be removed, such as the fuel rails and stuff like that. But it actually, honestly, is easier, in my opinion, than doing that in 52, for example. Under the valve cover, everything looked pretty good. I got the new valve cover on, and everything looked nice and clean. The Amazon valve cover that I bought fit perfectly with no issues, and then I reinstalled everything with a new BMS intake. So now this is when shit started becoming a real pain in the ass. So the front side of the block was just absolutely covered in oil, and the belt was, just way too oily for me to want to run. So I took the Serpentine belt off and I did a whole bunch of degreasing. I bought a new one from a local parts store, and I was having a whole bunch of fun trying to put it back on. When I looked up the belt diagram, I didn't know at the time, but I was looking at this picture, and this picture claimed that N54 and N55 had the same belt route. And guess what? They don't. So I was wasting a whole bunch of time getting really pissed off trying to do it. And then I noticed that the cashier at the parts store had given me the wrong belt. My buddy was there because I had promised him that the 335 would be done and that he could experience it for the first time with me. So me being impatient and pissed off, I decided to grab the original belt that was on it, clean it off a bit, and then try and put it back on. And two things. I didn't know that the N55/N54 tensioner can lock open with a pin, and I was still looking at the wrong belt diagram. So I had my buddy relaxing the tensioner with a breaker bar as I was trying to feed the belt around the diagram that was wrong. And after multiple attempts, we ended up shearing the Torx bit on the tensioner. And after the fact is when I realized that we were looking at the wrong diagram. So I was pretty pissed off, not at him, but just the whole situation. So funny enough, during this time, I owned 3 BMWs, 2 N52 cars, and the 335. My main N52 at that time was down due to water pump issues and some electrical issues, so I was forced to drive the N52 car that I was selling at that time. So after that long stressful day of working on my 335, I get into my only working BMW at that time, the 328xi that I was selling, and I turn it on to go home and the coolant light pops on. It was just a subtle way of all three cars punishing me all at once. Yeah, so anyways, so I just decided to buy a new belt tensioner kit from FCP Euro. After opening the package, I also got an email saying that I was involuntarily one of FCP Euro's largest shareholders. Owning 3 BMWs all at once is surely a punishment. Once I took off the old tensioner, there was still a ton of grease that built up underneath it, so I got to degrease the engine more than I was originally going to. And plus, you really don't want to mess around with greasy things on your belt on these cars. So it kind of turned out to be a good thing. So after everything was put back together, I did the proper priming procedure for the oil filter house and gasket that's suggested by BMW, and I was very happy to find out that the car did not have any check engine lights and was no longer in limp mode. So then I lifted the car up in the air to do a coolant change and an oil change. At this point, I figured it'd be best to do 2 birds in 1 stone, so since I was taking off the stock intercooler anyways to drain the coolant, I figured now would be a good time to install my new VRSF 5-inch intercooler. I expected it to be an easy installation, but it was more complicated than I thought. It's really not that complicated, but fitment was just shitty, and I didn't realize that you had to remove one of the inlets, the stock inlets. You had to cut it off so you can install their stupid fucking moored silicone hoses. So I was f***ing with it for a bit until I realized that. I was already stressed and pissed off at that point, so once I cut the inlet off, I was still having trouble fitting it all up. I was getting really pissed off at the car. I was telling myself, like, I could be doing all this, I can be really stressing myself out, and the car could still spin a bearing. The thing was, at that time, I just didn't know what was going to happen. So I just got sick of it, and I got the help of a friend of mine who's familiar with 335s to give me a second hand on mounting up the VRSF intercooler. Having a second hand and a second set of eyes really helped installing when the fitment was kind of rough. So after that was done and the fluids were all changed, I thought I was finally done. Well, guess what?
While I'm waiting for your fucking response.
I thought wrong. The Mickey Mouse flange when I took it off previously had broken, and I didn't realize it. So sure enough, it was pissing coolant everywhere. I tried cutting corners at this point. I tried using some O-rings that I had sitting around and some gasket sealer, and that didn't work. But I was able to source out a metal Mickey Mouse flange at a local parts store, and I eventually got that to work. After, of course, buying more coolant from my local BMW dealer. It was probably the 3rd bottle of coolant that I bought in like 2 weeks, considering I had just done a water pump on an N52. A coolant hose on the N52 had blown off after I had replaced the water pump. I had just flushed and filled my 335 with new coolant and had been topping off all of my cars. So yeah, a lot of coolant was unnecessarily wasted.
I just need a bottle of coolant. BMW. You guys probably sell a whole lot of this stuff, yeah? Yes. Yeah.
So after that, the car was finally done, and I finally got to drive it, and I enjoyed it. Aside from the smoke, all the smoke, I'm just kidding, it was a lot of built-up oil and coolant on the exhaust manifold, but the car ran fine, and I was finally able to enjoy my 335. But not for long, because having no issues at all on a 335 will never last. But anyways, I guess the moral of my story is, if you know about BMWs, you can save a ton of money on people who don't know about BMWs. You can buy them cheap because people think they are more complex than they are. So if you know what to look out for, and you're willing to fix it yourself, you can really benefit. Basically, I had just replaced some gaskets, a simple fuel pump, and some fluid change. And I had a car for a massive discount. So anyways, yeah, keep that in mind. And yeah, that's about it. So yeah, thanks for listening to my story. I've got a lot of BMW content on the way of all different platforms. So, be sure to subscribe and like and comment and all that shit. Thanks.